Hello and welcome back. So we're talking about personal identity over time, um, and we looked at and kind of dismissed rather quickly the idea that you are in some way some kind of physical object. Um, Locke, you remember, made distinctions between um, the conditions for identity over time for things like rocks, and he had a separate idea of how living things like trees and animals and human beings uh, are the same over time, and then that was distinct from personal identity, which was had to do with memory, right, and your psychological continuity. Well, let's look back at this sort of second set of identity conditions. Olson here is going to kind of pick up on that and argue that you're not your memory, you're not your mind. Instead, you are a an animal, right? You are a human being, a species of animal, and that's what makes you you over time. So we're going to look at this argument, which is one that we haven't seen yet. So animalism is the claim that we are human beings, right? So essentially human beings, right? What makes me the same me over time? The fact that you're the same human being over time, right? And this is importantly different from the views we've seen before, which assumed some kind of mental thing, right? So that I could, whatever, I could upload my consciousness into a computer and still be me. On this view, you wouldn't, right? Because you wouldn't be the same animal. You'd be a computer. So he's defining human being as a kind of animal, and he's saying that's what you are, essentially, right? Um, in one sense, it seems obviously true. Yeah, I am a human being, right? But as we've seen arguments to say, well, no, the essence of you is not your physical body, right? Or the living organism you are. Instead, you're something mental. Um, and So first he wants to, Olson, before he gets into his argument that you are in fact just a human being, right, and that's what makes you you over time, um, he's going to argue, he's going to clarify some some terms, right, some terminology, because he thinks some of the way we talk about this stuff has become a little confused. So again, animalism is his view that you are identical to some human organism. That's what makes you you over time. Um, some people like to resist that uh, view, right? By claiming, okay, yeah, in one sense we're an animal, but they kind of secretly are not using the identity relation. When they say you're an animal, and Olson wants to say you are identical to some animals in the same way that 2 plus 2 equals 4 in a very strong mathematical sense of identity. And so there's other people that want to say, well, yeah, you're an animal, but not like in the sense that you're identical to an animal, right? So people will say something like, well, you're constituted by an organism, but you could in principle be separated from it in like a Freaky Friday scenario or uploading your consciousness and so on, right? Olson says you guys are messing with the notion of what it means to be something, right? It says, um, if you're not identical to an organism, then you are not that organism, right? Saying, well, you're not identical, but you're constituted. He says that's just salesman's hype. They're just playing with words. Either you are or you aren't, right? And so those people, um, if you can't commit to the identity relation between you and the organism that you are, then don't try to borrow its plausibility by using some other relation like constitution. So we've talked about materialism, right? When we talked about Churchland and philosophy of mind, and what sort of things are minds? Are they material objects? So animalism is not identical. It's not the same thing as materialism, right? Although they are importantly related. So materialism says that I'm identical to some collection of matter, right? Some material thing. Um, so animalism is sort of a subgroup of materialism, right? So if you're an animalist, you are definitely a materialist, but it's not necessarily the other way around. So yeah, if I'm an animal, animals are material things, right? If I'm a human organism, human organisms are material things. So any animalist is going to be materialist. But you can imagine someone being a materialist that's not an animalist, right? So um, if I think that I can upload myself into a computer, well, computers are material things. So that's another kind of materialist that you could be, but you wouldn't be an animalist, right? An animalist say, if you upload yourself into a computer, you're not you anymore, right? So materialism and animalism related but different, right? Two other concepts that Olson wants to make keep distinct and clear is the notion of an animal and the notion of a person. So we are persons, says Olson, right? But we are also animals, right? But not all persons need necessarily be animals, right? So if you believe in angels, angels would be persons, right? They're the types of things that are able to make decisions and be morally culpable for right and wrong. Uh, if there's some sort of aliens out there uh, that qualify as persons, they don't have to be humans, right? They don't even have to be animals. They could be made of silicone or something else. So there could be animal persons, like if we think if it turns out dolphins are intelligent enough, maybe they end up being persons, but they're not human organisms. So you can be an animal, you can be a person. A person just is something that satisfies the criteria of like, are they morally culpable for things? Can we praise or blame them for what they do? Um, so humans are animals, they're also persons, but animal and person are different categories. Um, And he's not just making the claim, so he's trying to distinguish animals and persons, and he's not just saying that all animal people are animals, which is true. He's saying that all human people are animals, right? Um, and this is important because some philosophers claim that no persons are animals, right? So, for example, if you're Descartes, and you think that you are a thinking thing, that's what makes you you, and the thinking thing is in a soul, right, a non-physical substance, then you go with the soul. That's where you go. The body is not you, according to Descartes, right? And so Descartes would say all the persons are not animals, all the persons are souls, right? Olson is definitely not saying that, right? He's saying that if you're a human, you're a person and you're an animal. So, and then he talks a lot about whether you're essentially an animal and uh, essence and accidents and stuff like that is sort of philosophical terminology that's not crucial to understand. So we can skip over it for now. If you're interested in it, we can chat about it in office hours or something. Uh, he also has to say a little bit about bodies, right? So there can be different types of bodies. Bodies can be organic or inorganic, right? You could have a robotic body, like the Terminator here. Um, if you're an animal, you're organic. So according to Olson, since human beings are animals, which he hasn't argued for yet, but that's his claim, right? Um, then if you got a robot body, you can't be that can't be you, right? I cannot have my whole body replaced by a robot body and still be me, according to Olson, right? To be an animal, you need to be organic, right? So that's a strong claim and something that people might intuitively push back against, right? But he's making his point clear, right? And, um, now he says you don't have to worry about it right now, right? Because nobody has a robotic body yet. Um, and so he's not too worried about it. And he says if you're basing your whole notion of personal identity over time over the possibility that someone might have a robotic body, he doesn't think that's the right way to think about things. It doesn't seem very useful, right? Because it's not really grounded in reality. Um, so he says I'm not going to talk about that. If it becomes more possible and there's more people running around with robotic bodies, then we'll worry about it. Um, but he's not too worried that his view entails that, um, yeah, someone like the Terminator could not be a person. If you had your body replaced by a robotic body, you wouldn't be you anymore, says Olson, right? Take it or leave it. So he wants to make it clear, some people say, are you saying that we're just animals? We're merely animals? We're no better than dogs or something like that? And he says, well, it depends on what you mean by merely. Um, so in one sense, yes, right? If you think of like, if you're saying, uh, so here's how I want to frame this, right? I am an animal, right? But I'm not merely an animal because I'm other things, right? I'm a father and I'm a son and I'm a teacher and I'm a husband, right? So I'm a lot of things, among those an animal, right? But in another sense, am I identical to some animal? Sure, right? So in that sense of merely an animal, yeah, right? According to Olson, I'm not a soul, right? I'm not something over and above the physical body, living body that I have, right? Um, so in that sense of merely, yes, I'm merely an animal, but can I do more things than a dog does, right? Of course, right? I am other things besides an animal, right? So he he thinks that people that are trying to say, oh, animalism just means we're no better than dogs or no different than dogs. No, that's not what he means at all. So there obviously are other views besides animalism. We've seen several of them. Descartes says, no, you are not your body at all. You are your soul, and your soul is a non-physical substance, right? Um, you might think that we are some kind of composite of a soul and an animal, right? And you need both parts together to be you. Um, Hume thinks if there's a you at all, you're just a bundle of perceptions. So there's lots of other views. Putnam says, look, you are a functional organization of parts, right? So in that sense, you're kind of actually, you're an algorithm, you're an abstract object, right? So yeah, you could upload your self into a computer as long as the computer is performing the same operations that your brain is, right? Then that would be fine. Um, Putnam would say that, that if you ever watch Star Trek and you see the transporters, right? So they, uh, Kirk and Spock step into the transporter and they go, and what happens is basically they're destroyed on the Enterprise, right? Their atoms are taken apart, and then they grab atoms from the planet wherever they're trying to reassemble them, and they reassemble Kirk and Spock from totally different atoms, right? So no atom has actually um, is the same between Kirk when he's transported from the ship to the planet. But what's the same is the functional organism of the atoms, right? They're put back together in the same configuration that they were before. So that's a functionalist view. If you think Spock on the Enterprise is the same Spock as Spock on the planet, you're a functionalist, like Putnam, right? Or you could be a Buddhist and say there is no self. What is the self? It's nothing. And some readings of Hume, that seems to be what Hume is saying too, right? Um, so Olson, right, rehashes all these different views of the self to say these are pretty crazy, right? Um, if this is the competition, um, why has nobody been pushing animalism yet, right? Because Olson's writing in the 21st century here. Um, he says I'm a human organism seems like a pretty intuitive approach to this. So maybe we should revisit it because all the other competitors are kind of out there. So what are the arguments against animalism? It seems like an intuitive thing that you wouldn't even have to argue for right away. If somebody asks you, hey, what are you essentially? You say, well, I'm this, I'm a human being, right? Seems obviously true. Um, so what's the argument against that? Well, um, the, some of the main arguments against animalism come from dualists like Descartes, right? Who say, uh, because matter can't think, right? And we saw Descartes' argument for dualism. Says, well, look, it's conceivable that I could come apart from my body, right? And if it's conceivable, then it's possible. And if it's possible, then I can't be identical to my body, and so on. I won't rehash that whole argument, right? Um, but dualism, we saw Princess Elizabeth, and she had a serious objection to dualism. And also, there's less tendency for people to want to believe in souls, in sort of universities these days. So actually, most philosophers of mind and most scientists are probably materialists these days if you surveyed them. So why aren't they animalists? Says Olson, right? Well, he thinks the problem is they're too focused on personal identity over time, which is what we've been focused on too. So we're guilty as well, right? And so when you get these, ideas of like, well, what would happen to me if this radical change happened? If it was a Freaky Friday scenario and I switched, memories and stuff with my mom, which one would be me? Um, if you're thinking about, identity conditions over radical changes in time, then you might tend to want to give up on animalism. He says, but if we just focus on what we are right now in this moment, animalism seems much more popular, much more plausible. Yeah, we are human beings. So, the biggest competitor to animalism is the psychological continuity view, Locke's view, right? Um, so the idea is identity can, what makes you you over time is your psychology. And if I can put your brain into a different body, and I can upload your brain into a computer, and as long as your memories are the same, there's some connection over time to earlier you, you are you, right? And that's not animalism, right? Animalism says no, you have to be the same organism over time, right? Um, and there are, uh, right, some reasons to like that view, right? So, yeah, the Freaky Friday scenarios sort of do push you towards the psychological continuity view, but other intuitions push against it, right? So you want to say, well, what if, at the end of my life, when I sort of slip into a coma or I'm in a vegetative state, am I still me? If my, family comes to visit me in the hospital, are they visiting me? We kind of want to say, yeah, right? And also early in life, when I'm an infant and I don't remember anything from when I'm an infant, but am I still me? I want to say, yeah, that's still you. And what's behind those intuitions? It's the same body, right? It's the same living organism from when I'm an infant to when I am slipping into a coma at the end of my life, right? Um, so yeah, the Freaky Friday scenarios definitely, favor the psychological continuity view, but other intuitions favor the animalism view, and they're kind of, Olson argues, kind of even, right? They're sort of even Steven. Um, how do you pick between the two? So he says, well, let me give you an argument for animalism, and maybe that'll tip the scales in favor of animalism, right? The view that you are just this organism, this body, right? So and he says, look, I know there's an appeal to psychological continuity, but I think there's an equal appeal to animalism, right? Um, so here's an argument. Premise one, there is a human animal sitting in your chair. Presuming that you're sitting in a chair right now, that seems true. Yeah, definitely there's a human animal in the chair. Premise two, the human animal sitting in your chair is thinking. Well, certainly if you're watching this, lecture and you're thinking about what I'm saying, then yeah, the human animal sitting in your chair is thinking. Premise three, you are the thinking being sitting in your chair, right? Therefore, by four, you are that human animal, right? Um, so certainly a valid argument, right? From those three premises together, right? If you accept that there is a human animal in your chair that is thinking and you're the thinking thing in the chair, then you would have to conclude that you are a human animal, right? Um, the argument's valid, but if you want to, push back against animalism, or if you want to question this argument or critically assess it, you have to ask yourself, are each of these premises true? They seem pretty obviously true on the face of them, right? But, John Locke or someone committed to a different philosophical view is going to try their best to push back on these premises, right? So let's see if any of these premises might actually be false, or what you would have to commit to say that one of these premises is false. So premise one, that there is a human animal in your chair, could be false if there are no human animals, right? Um, why would you think that? Well, there are people, any crazy view that you think of, there's a philosopher that's had it. And there are philosophers who said, no, there are no animals at all. Um, namely, they're called idealists. So this is a theory of a philosophy of mind that we actually didn't get into in this course. Um, but it's the view that uh, actually there are no bodies, there are no material substances at all. We're all just ideas. And the idea of idealism is, well, all I ever get are perceptions, right? Impressions on my mind, right? Pain is in my mind. All, my visual experience is in my mind. Uh, and why do we need to posit that there's external objects causing those sensations, right? It's sort of an Occam's razor argument, but instead of for materialism, it's for idealism. It says, yeah, dualism is silly. That's too many things, but why do we need the material stuff? Let's just say that we are ideas, right? That's all there is ideas. So that's a view um, that Berkeley had. Um, and if you were Berkeley, then you would not accept premise one. You wouldn't accept there's a human animal sitting in the chair. You would say, no, there is an idea sitting in an idea, kind of, right? Um, but there's not, look, nobody's an idealist these days, right? It's a view you can have, it's interesting, but it's not popular. So uh, if believe it if you can. If you want to be an idealist, and then you don't have to believe this argument for animalism. But if you're not an idealist, then it seems like you have to accept premise one. So premise two, there's a right the human being, or sorry, the human animal in your chair is thinking, right? Um, could you challenge that? It seems like, yeah, there's a human in my chair and that human is thinking. Um, but if you're a dualist, you could deny that. You could say, look, there's a human animal in the chair, but that's not doing the thinking. It's the soul that's doing the thinking, right? So there's two things in the chair, um, the human animal and the soul, and yeah, it's not the human animal that's thinking. So if you're an idealist, you don't have to believe premise one. If you're a dualist, you don't have to believe premise two. But again, most people aren't dualists these days either, right? I mean, well, I wouldn't say most people, right? Because there's a lot of religious traditions out there among, everyday folks that do believe in souls and do very much think that, no, I've got a body, but I've also got a soul, and that's going to go to heaven. There's not a lot of philosophers in academic philosophy these days that are dualists, right? So maybe you don't want to believe, maybe you can get off the train of this argument on premise two because, hey, you're committed to you know, a religious tradition or something that says, yeah, I do have a soul, and the soul is what does the thinking, right? But Olson's talking to philosophers here, and dualism is not super popular these days. So he thinks that most of his readers are going to believe premise one and have to believe premise two. So what about premise three? So premise three says, okay, if you accept that there's a human, being in the chair and the human being is thinking, you also have to accept that you're the thing that's thinking, right? Um, the thinking animal is you, right? Um, so could you deny that? Uh, I mean, you could get sort of tricky with it, I guess, if you wanted. You could say, even if you're not a dualist, you could say, well, the animal is thinking, yeah, but also I'm thinking, and I'm not identical to the animal in some way, right? Um, so there's sort of two things in the chair, right? Um, I don't know exactly what sort of philosopher would believe that. I guess maybe, yeah, I don't think even a functionalist would deny premise three, um, because you might say, well, look, yeah, there's a human animal in the chair, but I'm the functional organization of that animal, and so I'm distinct. But I don't think functionalists think that. I think they would say that your mind is realized by the physical body, which is a term that came up when we talked about functionalism. So uh, Olson doesn't think that you can really deny premise three, right? So you could be a dualist or you could be an idealist, but if you're not, you seems like you have to accept this argument for animalism. So he admits, look, the lock, the psychological continuity view, um, it's 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 got some stuff going for it, right? We do have these Freaky Friday intuitions that, yeah, if you know, me and my mom somehow switched bodies, that my mom's body would house me, right? Even if it was totally disconnected from my body. But he says we've also got equally strong intuitions, right? Especially about early in life and end of life, right? Even when psychologically I have nothing in common with myself as an infant, or at the end of my life when psychologically I'm kind of checked out, we still want to say that's me, right? And that's an animalist intuition, right? That's an Olson style intuition. And he's got his argument, right? Which he says, unless you're a dualist or an idealist, you'll have to accept this argument for animalism. Then he thinks there's a good case to be made for animalism as, at the very least, a serious competitor to psychological continuity view. All right. I will see you next time.